The board of this company included 2 former Secretaries of State, 2 former Secretaries of Defense, a former head of the CIA and several senators. It was possibly the most powerful boardroom in America. Not one of them held a medical degree. In 2014, a 23-year-old junior employee named Tyler Schultz stood in the company's laboratory and watched something he could not explain. Quality control results that failed were being deleted, and the machines were producing wildly different answers for the same sample. He raised it internally and was told he did not understand the science. So he took it to someone he trusted completely, his own grandfather. His grandfather was George Shultz, former Secretary of State, and a member of this company's board. The old man listened to his grandson describe what he had seen with his own eyes, and then told him he was mistaken. The board had been assured everything was working. The company was Theranos, and it was valued at $9 billion on the promise that it could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood. That machine never worked. What makes this case different from every other one in these files is not the money that vanished. It is that while the money was being raised, real patients were getting real results, and making real decisions about their bodies based on them. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19 with an idea and an unusual amount of certainty. She had a fear of needles and a conviction that the standard blood draw, the vial, the arm, the laboratory, was a technology stuck in the last century. Her proposal was simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to build, a small box that could run a full panel of tests from a finger prick. The pitch was not really about technology. It was about a future everyone wanted to be true, cheap tests in every pharmacy, disease caught early, nobody afraid of needles again. She told it in a black turtleneck, in a deliberately lowered voice, in the visual language of a famous technology founder, and Silicon Valley, which had spent a decade being rewarded for betting on college dropouts with grand visions, recognized the shape of the story immediately. And that shape is the point. Software is forgiving, you ship something imperfect, users complain, you fix it next week. Medical diagnostics are not forgiving, because the product is a number that a doctor uses to decide whether you have cancer. Theranos was run like a software company and regulated like nothing at all, and the gap between those two facts is where this entire story lives. Inside the building, the defense against scrutiny was secrecy, and it was unusually severe. Employees were divided into groups that were not permitted to discuss their work with each other, so that the people building the hardware did not talk to the people running patient samples. Non-disclosure agreements were extensive. Former staff described being escorted out on the day they resigned. The stated reason was protecting intellectual property from competitors. The effect was that almost nobody inside could see the whole picture. Now look at who was assembled to oversee it. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry and James Mattis, both former Secretaries of Defense. Sam Nunn, a former senator who had spent decades on nuclear security. This was a board that could have advised on a war. On the question of whether a blood analyzer actually produced accurate results, it had almost no capacity to judge at all. The investors followed the same pattern. The money did not come from the venture funds that specialize in medicine and would have demanded peer-reviewed data. Those firms looked and declined. It came from a media magnate, from the family behind America's largest retailer, from private families with enormous wealth and no laboratory expertise. Roughly $900 million, raised largely from people who could not evaluate the product. The commercial deals were what turned a private valuation into public exposure. A national pharmacy chain agreed to put Theranos testing centers inside its stores, and a large supermarket group spent a reported $350 million building clinics in its supermarkets, clinics that, in the end, never opened for Theranos testing at all. Both companies had been given demonstrations. Neither, by later accounts, was permitted to independently validate the device before signing. So what was actually inside the box? The device, named after Thomas Edison, was supposed to perform dozens of different tests on a few drops of blood. In practice, running many different assays on a tiny sample is a genuinely hard problem in physics and chemistry. The smaller the sample, the more a single stray molecule distorts the result. The machine could do a small number of tests, unreliably. The solution the company adopted is the fact that turns this from failure into fraud. For the great majority of tests offered to the public, Theranos did not use its own machine at all. It used ordinary commercial analyzers bought from established manufacturers, the same machines any hospital laboratory uses, and, because the fingerprick sample was too small for them, diluted it first. Diluting a sample to make it fit a machine is not a neutral act. It pushes small quantities toward the edge of what the instrument can reliably detect, and it makes results drift. Former employees and regulators later described tests that failed the company's own quality checks, and results released anyway. This is the part where the story stops being about investors. There is a phrase Silicon Valley uses to excuse this kind of thing: fake it till you make it. Announce the product, sell the vision, then race to build what you promised before anyone notices the gap. For a photo-sharing app, the worst outcome is an embarrassing outage. The argument this case settles is that the phrase has a hard boundary, and the boundary is where the customer is a patient, because a patient cannot wait for version 2. There was also a military claim, and it matters because of who was making it. The company suggested its devices could be used in battlefield conditions, carried in helicopters, deployed with troops, saving lives where a laboratory could not reach. A retired general on the board advocated for exactly that. No such deployment ever happened. But the story of soldiers being saved is a powerful thing to have attached to your product while you are raising money. In 2013, the company put its testing centers inside a national pharmacy chain, first in California and then across Arizona. Ordinary people walked in for routine blood work. Some were told they might be having a miscarriage. Some received results suggesting serious illness. Doctors, unaware of what was happening behind the counter, acted on the numbers in front of them. Theranos would eventually void or correct roughly 1 million test results in Arizona alone. Think about what that sentence contains: 1 million pieces of medical information, issued to real people, that the company itself later withdrew. Some of those people had already made decisions. That is the cost that does not appear on any balance sheet in this series. It is worth being precise about what the regulators found when they finally arrived, because it was not a paperwork dispute. Inspectors from the federal agency that oversees clinical laboratories documented failures in quality control and proficiency testing, and concluded that the deficiencies posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. That is a specific regulatory phrase, and it is not used lightly. The laboratory director was barred from operating a lab for 2 years. Why did the retail partners not simply test the device themselves? The answer is the most human thing in this story. Internal accounts describe a fear that if they hesitated, a competitor would sign instead and own the future of retail healthcare. A consultant hired to evaluate the technology reportedly raised concerns and was cut out of the process. The deal went ahead because the greater perceived risk was not being wrong, it was being left behind. The people who tried to stop it were, almost without exception, junior. Erica Chung, a recent graduate working in the laboratory, watched the quality control failures and eventually contacted the federal regulator directly. Tyler Schultz, after being dismissed by his own grandfather, kept going. Both were very young, both were correct, and both discovered what happens when you are correct against a $9 billion company. The company hired one of the most feared litigators in America. Former employees described being followed, threatened with lawsuits they could not afford to fight, and pressured to sign statements. Tyler Schultz's family reportedly spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. The dispute split a grandfather and grandson for years. And all of this was in defense of a machine that did not work. And the pressure applied to the reporter and his sources was itself extraordinary. The company's lawyers contacted his newspaper repeatedly, demanding the story be dropped and disputing the sourcing. Former employees who had spoken were pursued for breach of their agreements. One board member reportedly told the newspaper that the story would be a mistake. A media organization with less money, or less appetite for a fight, would very likely have stopped, which is the actual reason frauds of this size survive as long as they do. What finally broke it was a reporter and a telephone. John Carreiro of the Wall Street Journal received a tip, spent months persuading frightened former employees to talk, and on the 16th of October, 2015, published an article stating plainly that the company was running the vast majority of its tests on other companies' machines. The response was denial, then legal threat, then silence. But regulators had now been given a map. Inspectors arrived at the laboratory and found conditions serious enough that they concluded patients were placed in immediate jeopardy. The laboratory's license was revoked. Its partner pharmacy chain ended the relationship and later sued. The valuation, which had never been anything but a number people agreed on, went to nothing. This is Elizabeth Holmes in 2013, at the height of it, a photograph taken at a national security discussion in Washington, which tells you how completely the credibility had been established. In 2018 the securities regulator charged her with what it called an elaborate, years-long fraud, and the company dissolved. The criminal trial ran through the autumn of 2021. In January 2022 the jury returned a verdict that deserves to be quoted exactly, because almost everyone remembers it wrongly. She was convicted on 4 counts of defrauding investors. On the counts relating to patients, the jury acquitted her, and could not reach agreement on several others. Read that again. The legal system found it proven that she had deceived the people who gave her money, and did not find it proven that she had wronged the people who gave her their blood. She was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months and reported to prison in 2023. Her former partner and chief operating officer, Ramesh Balwani, was convicted on 12 counts, including those relating to patients, and received a longer sentence. The distinction between the two verdicts has been argued about ever since, and it is not a comfortable one. The aftermath changed how money moves in medicine, at least for a while. Investors in health technology started demanding peer-reviewed validation before writing checks. Founders in the sector complained for years that they were being asked questions no software company would face, which was, of course, exactly the point. Diagnostics is not software, and the correction was overdue rather than unfair. So place this beside the other cases. Enron had a board that waived its own ethics rules. FTX had no board at all. Theranos had the most decorated board in America, and the result was identical, because a board's function is not to be impressive. It is to ask questions that the people running the company do not want asked, and that requires understanding what the company actually does. There is a second pattern here that is worth naming. In every one of these stories, the person who first said the emperor had no clothes was Junior, poorly paid, and personally destroyed for it. Sharon Watkins at Enron. Harry Markopolos with Madoff. The Financial Times reporters at Wirecard. Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz here. The system does not lack people who notice. It lacks any mechanism that makes noticing safe. One number is worth sitting with. At the peak, Elizabeth Holmes was described as the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, worth about $4.5 billion. 2 years later the same publication revised her net worth to zero. Nothing had been stolen from her in between, no market had crashed. The $4.5 billion had never existed in the first place, it was a number produced by multiplying a share price nobody had tested against a company nobody had audited. That is what evaluation is, and this series is largely a catalog of people forgetting it. And here is the question I will leave you with, because it is the one this case asks that the others do not. Theranos raised $900 million and the investors lost it. That is a normal risk, freely taken by adults who could afford it. But somewhere in Arizona there is a person who was told they might be losing a pregnancy, or that they might have cancer, based on a result the company itself later withdrew. No court has quantified that. So when we tell these stories as tales of vanished billions, ask yourself what the real ledger looks like, and who is actually on it. The investors were repaid in headlines and lawsuits. The patients were repaid in a letter telling them their result had been withdrawn, and nothing else at all. Tell me in the comments. And subscribe, because on this channel, the ledger always comes due.